So community corrections, who remembers what that is from the lecture a few days ago? I think I figured out that there's like two groups of students in this overall class. There's like ones that pay attention to the lectures and don't come to this, and the ones that don't pay attention to the lectures and do come to this. Have I cracked the code? Maybe. As long as you're getting the content, it doesn't matter. Anyway, so community corrections pretty much is just keeping the offender in the community or as close to the community as possible that they're from. So as far as like actual incarceration goes, this usually takes the form of putting them in a prison that's as close as possible to their home and their family, so their family doesn't have to drive like 10 hours or take a plane. But mostly this refers to what kind of correctional sentence. Yeah.
Probation?
Yeah, probation. Or parole, but we'll go into that later. So what makes this a good idea? Why is this effective? Why would you want to keep them in their home community? Any ideas? If you were on probation as a punishment, do you think you may fare better as far as rehabilitation goes if you're close to home as opposed to somewhere else? Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty simple. See, we've already talked about probation, or somebody already brought that up. It's the most common type of community corrections. And it comes from the Latin phrase, however you want to pronounce it, which means like a test, trial, or approval. It's got a lot of approximate definitions. And pretty much the offender stays in the community and remains under supervision for a set amount of time. So who remembers what a suspended sentence is? That's something we went over in here. Yeah.
Isn't it when like the judge gives you like a strict set of like things you have to follow, and if you break it, then you go right back?
Yeah.
So,
Like think of it like you commit a crime, it's kind of bad, but it's not murder or anything. The judge gives you a 10-year sentence, but they're suspending it if you follow certain guidelines. That's pretty much what probation is. So you get a prison sentence, but they let you out and you only serve that prison sentence if you break the rules of your probation during the time of that, or during the time of when that sentence would occur. Does that make sense? So you gotta follow the court-ordered rules, or you go to jail, or prison in this case. Does that make sense? All right, let's talk about revocation. And this is what happens when you break violation, or when you violate your parole. And it results in the offender receiving the suspended sentence. And sometimes plus an additional sentence for whatever crime they committed to break their parole. What are some common examples of a probation violation that you often see on TV? Anybody think of one? What's a common condition of probation that people break? One would, oh, yeah.
Committing another crime.
Yeah, that would be one. So like, if a term of your condition is you can't steal anything else, and you go and steal something, or if part of your probation is a restraining order, and you violate that and intentionally get too close to someone, or if you leave the state or the country, sometimes you're not allowed to do that. Possessing a firearm, if that's one of your conditions. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that. All right. So I was gonna bring this up during like the capital punishment discussion thing, but it turned out we didn't really have any in-person classes during that time. But it's really fun and I wanna bring it up now. So speaking of Latin, who knows where the term capital punishment comes from? And don't cheat and Google it. What do you think when you hear capital punishment? Is capital punishment something you want to get? Why not?
You die.
Yeah, you die. So why is it called capital punishment? Somebody throw out a guess. So like capital as in like the capital of a state, it's like the highest level? That's what most people think? But no. The really cool thing about this is the C-A-P-I or capi in the name is the same root word that gives us decapitation, and it refers to a head. So this comes from a Latin phrase which means a crime worthy of decapitation. So capital punishment is punishment that results in death. So there's a fun fact for you to tell your family on Christmas. I always liked that. Anyway, let's go over some Supreme Court cases relating to corrections. So the first one is Memphis versus Ray. And just putting it pretty simply, you have the right to counsel while you're on probation. So even while you're on probation, you've got the right to a lawyer to help guide you through stuff. Everybody got that one? At one time it was kind of questionable because like when you're in prison, you lose some rights by virtue of being in prison. And for a while, if you were on probation, you were kind of in this weird purgatory between prison and not prison, and it was questionable which rights you had. And this Supreme Court's case pretty much specified that you do have the right to a lawyer while on probation. All right. Gagnon versus Scarpelli. And this is, you retain the right to due process even during revocation. So, if you're accused of a crime that breaks your violation, you still have a right to due process. Hello. So if you commit the crime, it breaks your probation, you've still got a right to due process to defend yourself before your probation is revoked. It's not just an automatic thing. Everybody got that one? Right. Morrissey versus Brewer. And like I tell everyone else, if you ever like don't get any of these written down in time, like the more detailed lecture PowerPoints by Dr. Head are all on Canvas, so you can always track it down that way. So Morrissey versus Brewer, and this just means you retain your rights while on parole. So just like you retain your rights while on probation, you still get those same rights while you're also on parole. So who knows what parole is? If you're sentenced to 20 years in prison with a possibility of parole after 15 years, what does that mean? It means you've got the chance to get paroled after 15 years, which means you can get out of prison, but there are conditions to that. So this is the most common way of being released from prison, parole. And you gain a conditional early release from prison, and you remain under supervision, very similar to probation, for the remainder of what your term would have been. And if you follow the guidelines of your parole, you don't have to go back for that length. So think of it like probation in reverse. Whereas probation, you have the supervised release before prison, this one is afterwards. Does anybody have questions about that or confused about which one's which? It's pretty much just probation afterwards. A lot of people hear parole and they think you just like get out of jail and it's all over, but not really the case. All right. So let's talk about some more Supreme Court cases related to prisoner rights. Cooper versus Pate. I've got to fight to keep myself from saying Pate because I'm so used to buying cat food and it's spelled like that. But prisoners have the right to challenge the conditions of their confinement. You're hearing a lot more of this recently due to prison overcrowding. We've got some prisons in like Texas that are so overcrowded, people are literally in tents surrounded by barbed wire out in the field. As Dr. Head explained, some prisons are even resulting to renting river barges, putting prisoners on those. So conditions are getting kind of cruddy in prisons. And you can actually challenge your confinement. If you're in inhumane conditions, you can bring that up and challenge it. Does anybody have any thoughts or opinions on this? All right. So Procunier or Procunier, however you want to say it, versus Martinez, so from 1974. This one's kind of fun. It's that rights and security must be balanced in prison, and that censoring and monitoring inmate mail is not a violation of their rights, because it's for the purpose of security. You can think of some examples of how inmate mail may be a security risk if it's not monitored. What can be snuck in via the mail? Weapons, yeah. Everybody's seen it like TV shows where they tear apart the stuffed animals to make sure there's nothing in them. Yeah. Somebody say something else? Drugs, yeah. There's that case not too long ago of somebody getting a cake and it had the nail file in it they used to escape. It's amazing what you can hide things in. But that would be like material stuff. What about communications themselves, censoring those? Or a lot of times what you'll see is the prison will, like if somebody receives a letter or sends a letter, they'll get it and they'll paraphrase it and transcribe it in a different way so that the same letter's getting out, but the way it was written isn't getting out. You'll see why here in a minute. And a lot of, especially like supermax prisons, if they don't employ like code breakers, they'll have some like on demand to like look over stuff to make sure there's no sort of like code going on. Before we go further, can anyone think of an example of this that they've heard of? Some of it gets kind of advanced, some of it's kind of really simple but genius. Now this next example that I'm going to show, I couldn't find any actual examples of it, so I kind of made one up that resembles it, but it was used by some gang members a while back, and it kind of flew under the radar for a while before prison officials caught on to what was happening. So the messages look something like this. Who can find where the code is in this?
The capital letters.
And somebody said the capital letters. What kind of code may be represented by letter capitalization here? I'll give you a hint. What the words actually say on the page mean nothing. It can be anything you wanted to say, because that's not the actual message at all. Anybody know what Morse code is? Basically communications with beeps and dashes. So the lowercase letters represent a dot, uppercase letters represent a dash, and it's in Morse code. Which is kind of really interesting that they would do that. And the actual letters would be really long and complicated and written really sloppily, so it would be hard to catch on exactly. But the person that received the letter would know. And this is why a lot of prison letters, like they'll take the letter itself, especially if it's like a supermax, and they'll just transcribe it either all in caps, or they'll change it in a way where if there's any code in it, the code will be destroyed to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And one of the letters like this that was actually caught and stopped in time was about sneaking in a certain amount of weapons to order a hit on one of the wardens. So they caught that one just in time. Kind of a more simple example would be letters like this, where every so many words reveal the actual message. I'll give you a minute to read the red letters, or the red words. So to get the actual message from this one, you go with every fifth word. Anyone kind of impressed with what happens in prison yet? And kind of on this example, talking about Morse code, this is kind of relevant, but also a really neat thing that I like showing students. Has anyone ever heard of the Better Days song? You have? Maybe? That's it. Okay, I'm gonna turn it down a little bit. So the origin of this was somewhere in South America years ago. There was a civil war going on, and a bunch of people were taken captive, and the controlling government of the area wanted to get a message to the captive people that help was coming, and so that they wouldn't give up and kill themselves or something. So they did that because they realized that the captors would just play the radio constantly at the prison camps, almost as a way of torture to keep them awake all the time. So they fabricated a fake pop song, put it on the radio constantly as if it were popular, and within that song was a hidden message that actually got to the prisoners. See if we can locate it. We'll listen to just a little bit. It's a Morse code message hidden within the guitar riffs, and if you don't speak Spanish, the words right before that happens in the lyrics, it is listen to this message. And it's repeated 3 times throughout the song, and people eventually caught on to it. So that's always a really fun example.
What was the message?
I think it pretty much is saying help is on the way, don't give up, your government is still here, because they were being told that the rebels had taken over the government. So yeah. I guess the moral of the story there is you can hide a message in pretty much anything you want. All right, any questions about that part? Nope. All right, so another case, Johnson versus Avery, 1968. Prisoners have the right to legal counsel if it isn't supplied already. So even if you're in prison, you've still got a right to have a lawyer present to discuss legal issues, mostly appeals. Has anyone ever seen the show Making a Murderer? It's not even that old.
On Netflix?
Yeah, okay, finally a student knows what I'm talking about. But that's a really good example of prisoners having lawyers and being able to fight back against their charges. If you haven't seen that, look it up on Netflix, it'll blow your mind. All right. Next one, Bounds versus Smith, 1977. And pretty much if the jail isn't able to supply a lawyer, they at least have to have a legal library for the prisoners. So you have to have some way of researching your rights and looking at your legal options. So just remember, Johnson versus Avery, you have the right to a lawyer. And Smith, if you can't get a lawyer, you have to at least have a library. These two are very similar. Remember the differences. Okay. Fullwood versus Clemmer, 1962. Inmates still have the right to their First Amendment freedom of religion. And this case specifically was brought on by a prison not accommodating a prisoner's Islamic religion. I'm not sure what the specifics were, but more than likely it had to do with like dietary restrictions. They weren't offering food that fit with that. And most of the time when it comes to this, it means prisons have to honor like the dietary stuff. Things have to be kosher or halal. Or if it comes to like allowing certain prayers at a certain time of day. Typical stuff within reason, but sometimes prisoners try to push it. So can anyone remember any examples that they've seen in the news? Like there was one prison where a group of inmates tried to create their own little denomination where, according to their religious beliefs, they had to have a full steak dinner and a glass of wine every night. And they argued that it was their religious liberty to do that, but that didn't really fly. And similarly, you can't say that my religion states that I can't be in prison. Like that's not gonna work either. So before we go, I've got another example of a prisoner trying to be really creative. Has anyone heard about this one? It didn't work either, but you gotta admire him for trying. I'm pretty sure he had a heart attack and was pronounced dead, but was resuscitated. And he tried to argue that technically since he died, his life sentence is served. Yeah. Anyway, so if you don't have any questions, that's it. Get ready for the final. If you're one of the people taking the comprehensive makeup, that's next week. I'm not sure they've nailed down a specific schedule for that yet, but just email me your Dr. Head if you're curious about it. But that's it.